Hey everyone, just a quickie because I'm terrible at remembering to write this stuff into my scripts, but if you enjoy the video, please remember to like, subscribe, and please leave me a comment. I always enjoy reading them. First one of the year, let's get started. Snatcher is a graphical adventure game produced by Konami and helmed by the legendary auteur of gaming Hideo Kojima. Released originally in 1983 for the MSX2 in Japan, it was later upgraded, localized to English and released for the Sega CD in 1992, which is the version I emulated in order to capture my footage. To call Snatcher a game might be something of a stretch. It's certainly some kind of interactive narrative similar to what we now call visual novels, but the closest it comes to having real game mechanics is a shooting gallery minigame that you end up playing for around 10% of the runtime, if I'm being generous. I know that's a pretty downbeat way to start a review, but since a lot of my views come from the same three guys refreshing their screens over and over to make the view ticker go up, I think they at least know that I only talk about games that I had an overall good time with. I'm too busy to waste my time hating something that somebody spent hours of their life putting together. And I don't want to attract that kind of audience. So despite my overall impression being less than glowing, I can tell you that I had a pretty good time with Snatcher, and while I'm really late to the party, I'm glad I came. I just might not come back anytime soon. Snatcher is more than just a game with a cult following though. It's a very interesting museum piece that was a stepping stone for Hideo Kojima. A man whose games, worlds, and stories have both been revolutionary and really pushed the boundaries of what's possible in this media, and at the same time seem to completely miss the point that games are something you play rather than watch. What's interesting about this time is we have a medium that has only just started to figure out what it's supposed to be, had no idea of the potential it had coming down the line, and a creator who was only in the early stages of becoming the rockstar game developer who can put fetus rocking mechanics into a game and everyone is just okay with it because it's him. The result of this is a fairly unique product that puts forward a lot of interesting ideas, but ultimately fails to deliver on all its potential. The problems here can't all be laid at the feet of the creators. Well, actually, they sort of can, but we'll get to that later. But it's a definite case of reach exceeding grasp. Kojima clearly saw the potential for cinematic storytelling that video games had, even back then, and pushed really hard to make that happen. The tech just wasn't there. Still, we've got this very interesting visual novel type experience that delves into one of my favourite genres, has an interesting mystery, a tone that swings so wildly I honestly don't know what, if any, part of it to take seriously, and an art style that has me absolutely frothing at the mouth. So, let's talk cyberpunk, cyborgs, and cybernetics. Let's meet a micro Metal Gear, a sex pest detective with a heart of gold, and try to solve a mystery, and in the process maybe just save the world from body snatching robots. This is Snatcher. It's hard to critique Snatcher or even talk about it without some frame of reference as to the mind that conceived it. Hideo Kojima is a man who I'm sure needs no introduction to anyone watching this video. This odd little man is something of a legend in the industry and has made some of the most polarizing games ever. Kojima has pushed the medium of video games forward in leaps and bounds, and helped standardize things like professional voice acting, cinematic cutscenes, and has overall played a large part in elevating games from being a child's toy that you're supposed to have grown out of by the time you become interested in sex. I'm so glad I'm not on Twitter anymore. To a medium on a par with the other big players that is capable of telling any kind of story and covering any kinds of themes or topics that they do. And yes, I am advocating for politics to be a part of games. Games are an artistic medium, and art reflects life. and is supposed to make us ask questions of our own views and consider the views of others as part of a personal journey of self-discovery. And what better way is there to do that than by literally looking through the eyes of another person and taking on their role? Snatcher, for example, was one of the earliest games to tackle more mature themes, including some scenes of nudity that were censored for the American version. I'm not going to show them here. You'll have to take my word for it or look it up for yourself. This is all because Kojima pushed for a game that felt as cinematic as possible, and to quote the wiki on this, development began between Kojima and his character designer Tomiharu Kinoshita, who both treated the project like making a film or anime rather than a game. Kojima's love for movies was fostered by his parents, though this line here in the wiki gives the impression that it was done almost at gunpoint. He became the original TikToker when a friend brought a Super 8 camera, not a cheap thing back then, and they started shooting movies together and then charging their friends 50 yen to see them. While he enrolled at university to study economics, his passion for telling stories and cinema remained strong the entire time. It's the classic story of studying something that feels safe and has a career path that is going to lead to job safety and a steady income, while secretly nurturing dreams of chasing down a passion and dealing with all the associated uncertainty connected with it. Kojima wanted to make movies, and he hoped that if he could win an award for his writing, he'd be approached about making one. However, in 1983, 1 year after I was born, well, again, my guess is a lot of you know what the Godzilla-sized event was that rocked Japan so hard that it went on to take over the world. A young Kojima saw the potential in video games for telling stories, and especially Nintendo's World Conqueror, which is what led him to joining Konami in 1986, despite many of his friends advising him against doing so. Social pressure is really hard in this country. Now, I'm not going to go into his work on Metal Gear here. The short version is that the game was having development problems because of the combat and hardware limitations, and Kojima was brought in to try and fix things. He did so by simply downplaying the combat in favour of hiding from enemies, and in the process he created the entire stealth game genre. The main point here is that we have a man with a flair for cinema and a love of stories and writing, who dreamed of making movies, now bringing all of that into games, specifically games with tight limitations due to early technology, and somehow, sort of, making it work. I say sort of because while there is no doubt this man has done wonderful things for the industry, and I personally love all the Metal Gear games that I've played, there are times he really seems to forget that he's working with an interactive medium, or where gameplay can feel like something of an afterthought compared to his hours of dialogue, or watching lengthy videos of cool stuff happening and wondering why I'm not the one controlling this action. On the other side of this, when we do finally get to play these games, we are often met with so many secrets, Easter eggs, and interesting systems that it often feels like playing some kind of light immersive sim, and you feel compelled to go checking every nook and cranny for hidden content in every area you visit.
See the item called cardboard box? Didn't seem much use to me, but Miller was adamant that you'd want it on the list. The last word in infiltration technology, or so he said.
Snatcher was envisioned as a 5-act story, but that had to be cut down due to its 18-month development cycle, which was considered lengthy at the time. The original MSX2 release had only 2 chapters and ended on a cliffhanger. Since a sequel never got greenlit, a 3rd chapter that patched in the ending was added for the Sega CD release, just shy of 6 years later. This makes for a much better ending overall, but it's still very clear that this story was hacked out of a much bigger one, and I have some thoughts about that to share later. So with all that in mind, I think we can maybe temper our critique a little. Between early hardware limitations, the fledgling nature of the media, and cuts imposed at higher levels, it's arguable that Snatcher stands tall within its boundaries. But it's also important to just look at what it is today and ask if it's worth playing for someone who has no other point of reference or nostalgia attached to it. And that may be quite the hard sell, all things considered. So, with all that out of the way, why don't we go and join the Junkers? So, Snatcher's story starts in a somewhat ham-fisted way, but one that absolutely oozes style and goes a long way towards setting us up for what we're getting ourselves into. We have some absolutely stellar music playing as we are introduced to the fork in history that creates the alternate future that our story takes place in. In 1996, an explosion destroyed a research facility in Moscow and released a bioweapon known as Lucifer Alpha into the atmosphere. The winds carry it into Eastern Europe, and the Eurasian continent, and it effectively wipes out 50% of the world's population. 50 years later, however, a new threat emerges. People are discovered to have been replaced with robots that can become almost perfect copies of their targets, right down to skin that can sweat and bleed. Nobody knows where they come from, what they want, or why they're infiltrating society. These new menaces are known only as...
These mysterious invaders become known as Snatchers.
We then get these cool opening credits with a music choice that could only have come from Japan in the late 80s. And while you might want to bash that start button and jump into the game as quickly as you can, let's just take a minute to enjoy some of the incredible pixel art that someone spent a long time working on. You never know, it might have some kind of payoff in the end. So yeah, sticking through all this introduces us to our protagonist, Gillian Seed. Definitely not a dangerously close to copyright infringement anime version of Rick Deckard from Blade Runner. Our narrator informs us that he and his wife were picked up in the Siberian neutral zone with severe amnesia, leaving one to wonder how anyone knew they were married, and apparently, according to Gillian, the only word that keeps coming up when he tries to regain his memory is Snatcher. As such, in a bid to jump his memory, Gillian has made quite the shocking decision.
Jamie, I've become a junker.
However, Jamie has this to say on the topic.
Yes, but I can sense that there is something terrible hidden in our past, and if we remember it, it will destroy us.
So this dialogue was clearly written by someone who has never listened to two people talk about anything ever. But I guess it's perfectly functional. Remember, this was written to run on an MSX2, so elegance had to give way to practicality, and the rule of show don't tell as such got thrown out the window. We are just in the intro though, and our goal is to get Gillian to his first day at his new job as quickly as possible and started with the game. Arriving at Junker HQ and cycling through the various text commands that make up this game's, I guess it's gameplay? We can eventually wind up in a conversation with Mika. Mika is one of the few characters we actually spend a significant amount of time with during this whole game. There are several scenes where we interact with her, learn more about who she is, and she helps us out on more than one occasion. We also have the option to flirt with her and literally every woman we meet in this game, and even ask her on a date. We will be shot down every time by her and every other woman we try to pull this unprofessional bullshit on. I guess this was some attempt at comedy, and while it's kind of funny, it's a touch creepy. Especially when we're talking to an 18-year-old girl who's just lost her father. Even so, Mika is pretty charming, and I overall enjoyed my banter with her. The other characters we meet though don't really get enough screen time to become fleshed out, which creates a few issues with the story later in the game. From Mika we can get a bit of an info dump on Snatchers and Junkers before being taken on a tour of the office. Since Snatchers have been considered the greatest threat to humanity since the Lucifer Alpha biohazard, then we're no doubt a member of an elite army with levels of access and authority as to be likened unto a megacity judge, right? Well, no. There's Mika and 3 other guys, only one of which is another field agent. So we have time to meet our chief and get our Junker ID badge from him, check out Jordan, the Junker's AI supercomputer, brush up our skills at the shooting range, this being the other half, well, maybe 1/10 of the gameplay, and finally meet our tech guy Harry, who supplies us with a less than subtle firearm and introduces our partner for this mission, our very own walking battle tank, Metal Gear.
Metal, introduce yourself.
Yes, sir. Pleased to meet you, Gillian. I am Metal Gear Mach 2.
Cute. So yeah, Snatcher isn't just a cyberpunk neo-noir detective story about terrifying body-snatching things lurking in the shadows, it's also a buddy cop movie, with our wet behind the ears bad boy Junker and his dorky but highly knowledgeable little robot friend. And I'm just gonna say straight up that I love Metal Gear. While I have my complaints about the story as a whole, especially what a mess it is tonally, the individual elements of the darker and more serious beats and the charming comedic moments work in isolation. Just not when they're happening right next to each other. Since Metal Gear is with us the entire time, he's easily the most developed character in the entire story aside from Gillian. Gillian and Metal's relationship is actually one of the best parts of the story. Gillian is less than impressed with this little guy when he shows up, especially when Metal Gear requests Gillian carry him when they are running. So we seem to have located a glaring problem with bipedal robots versus ones on wheels. Or, you know, a smartphone with an AI interface. Okay, yeah, Cyberpunk style over substance, I got it. Then there's this hilarious moment at the end of the first mission where Metal Gear freaks out during an escape from a building that's about to blow up.
Please save yourself. I am paralyzed with fear.
Metal Gear has all these charming little moments, including offering to spend Christmas with Gillian if no one else is available. I guess you're never alone when you have a nuclear-armed walking battle tank as a friend. This isn't the only reference to Kojima's previous work in the game. Indeed, there are references to both Metal Gear and other Konami titles, but we'll get to that later. Things go from 0 to 100 very quickly when our video phone goes off and Gibson, the other 50% of the Junker's field agents, informs us that he's got a probable Snatcher cornered and is in need of immediate backup, leading us to jump in our turbo cycle and rush off to save the day. When we arrive at this ominous looking abandoned factory, we see no sign of Gibson and... Gibson's fate is probably one of the most famous images from this game, and does a lot for establishing the threat levels of the Snatchers and the tone of the game's darker moments. Further investigations of the scene uncovers some clues that leads to an encounter with Insectors, and our first chance to test our shooting skills out in a real fight, before an epic escape from an exploding building. It's actually a pretty good start, and a good way to hook us into the adventure and the mystery. From here we begin our investigation into what Gibson was doing prior to his death, in a hope of hunting down the Snatchers that finally got him. The trail of clues of course leads us down a much deeper and darker rabbit hole than we are prepared for, but I'll talk a little more about that in the spoiler section. This was a pretty good start overall, but the story definitely has its problems, and being that the story really is the majority of what we have here, that means the game as a whole has a few problems. But let's move on and talk about other things for now and circle back to this later. The word anime can be polarizing to a lot of people. While these graphics were no doubt eye-catching to anyone in the 90s, I think many people today would take a look at Snatcher, think it's more anime garbage and be done with it. And I can totally vibe with that. Some people just don't like some things. I don't personally have any special attachment to anime for storytelling. That is to say, I judge everything based on its own strengths and weaknesses, and I like what I like, and I don't like what I don't like. When it comes to just pure style though, well again, love it or hate it, we can all agree that anime has a strong sense of identity, and those of us who've been around a while can probably even give you a rough idea of what decade a certain image came from, even without knowing the specific movie or series that it's from. With that in mind, and yes, I am about to sound exactly like an old man, they just don't make them like they used to. Snatcher is cyberpunk, and one of the staples of cyberpunk is style over substance. As I said before, why have a cell phone when you can have a mini walking Metal Gear following you around? Or why not just have it all grafted into your skull and fed into your optic nerves? Anime can really nail cyberpunk. Hell, Akira is one of the founding cyberpunk stories, to say nothing of Bubblegum Crisis, Ghost in the Shell, or more niche titles like Cyber City Oedo 808. That fucking hair, man. The 90s had a very distinct style that I absolutely love, and I get that nostalgia plays a big part in that. Art styles and trends change, and that's fine. No doubt 30 years from now, some content creator is going to be tapping away on their laptop in the air-conditioned safety of their capsule that protects them from the microwaved hellscape that is the world outside, and writing about how awesome and distinct the Kimetsu no Yaiba art style was as compared to today. Also, remember going outside? Man, that was wild. So for me, when it comes to presentation in both art style and music, Snatcher is a perfect 10. Even looking back at images from the much lower powered MSX version of the game, we can see style, flair, and vision. Snatcher is set in Neo Kobe, a futuristic city inspired and in places downright copied from Blade Runner. In fact, to say Snatcher wears its inspirations on its sleeves would be putting it mildly. While Gillian has his own distinct look, thanks to the incredible character work done by Tomiharu Kinoshita, he's clearly just an anime Rick Deckard, and as awesome as Neo Kobe looks, we can often find ourselves staring at exact shots from Blade Runner, just rendered out as pixel art. By the way, while this information is out there on numerous wikis to find, I do have to thank Indigo Gaming for putting me onto this first. His awesome Cyberpunk video series is partly what inspired me to finally jump into Snatcher and see what the fuss is all about. So, thanks bro. Neo Kobe has some awesome areas to explore, from a bustling downtown Christmas market, to creepy abandoned factories, to a bar called Outer Heaven. I did say we weren't done with callbacks. That is full of people cosplaying as classic Konami characters. I have to give props to this section for both looking awesome and also being a stark reminder of just how much has been lost since Konami decided it wasn't interested in making games anymore. I'd say some of the best artwork though is done in scenes with dramatic lighting. Some of these later flashback moments painted entirely in red tones really jump out and grab you. When it's not being a light-hearted buddy cop movie with inappropriate, barely legal nudity in it, Snatcher is also kinda creepy. There's a lot of areas painted in very dark colours, and it's in these moments in the dark that some of the game's best musical beats come out to really sell the sense of danger and unease you feel. This abandoned hospital we explore has a really creepy liminal space feel to it. It feels like this whole part of the world was forgotten and that we are violating something just by being here. Then there are the dark streets of some of the less developed areas of the city, showcasing the lowlife part of the high-tech lowlife that makes up Cyberpunk. Snatcher is also an example of the importance of style and good art direction in a game. Snatcher's visuals are basically timeless. I look at these character concept sketches, and I look at the in-game graphics, and it's pretty much perfect. And I'm not even sure if redrawing the images at a higher resolution would make any difference overall. Fortunately, we don't exactly have to guess what that would look like, because in 1993, Policenauts happened. Now, I'm not about to run off and do a full compare and contrast on these two games, but put simply, Policenauts is what Snatcher would have been visually if it had been made a few years later. Directed by Kojima with Tomiharu Kinoshita working in the art department, and we can see, yeah, these images are of a higher resolution, but can you honestly tell me that the difference is really that dramatic? I'm not going to sit here and make out that there aren't signs of aging in some areas of the game. Even with the retro pixel art revival, there are moments where the limitations of the era shine through. But thanks to good art direction, I'd say Snatcher has aged much better than many games from later console generations. We should also probably talk about the Snatchers themselves. These things are downright creepy at times. Conceived as some kind of hybrid of Terminator, Blade Runner's replicants, and the Body Snatchers, we only see these things briefly in some of the more dramatic moments in the game. They are often portrayed creeping out of the shadows with their glowing eyes and grinning skull-like faces, implying really malicious intent. Which is interesting because while what they are doing is bad, they are really just machines following protocols set by people. The how and why of that we'll get into later. A little part of me wishes I could drag this section out a little longer, like maybe we could drill down more into the technical side, but I think I'd be repeating myself a lot, and honestly, great art speaks for itself. Just look at how awesome these set pieces are. I don't really have to explain much more than that. So we need to move on to other areas of the game, and unfortunately, while the presentation blew me away, other parts of the game aren't so hot. I guess this is going to be one of the shorter sections of the video since the gameplay in Snatcher is threadbare to say the least. There are some who might liken this and indeed other visual novels to a choose-your-own-adventure book or something like that. That comparison fails though when you consider those books often had multiple routes that led to the same place, maybe with you picking up a different item along the way that would be important at some pivotal moment later in the story. In that sense, the logical digital expansion of those books would be something like Disco Elysium, where the digital medium allows for the books to be thousands of pages long and able to keep track of countless decisions made by the player along the way. Far from jumping to different points in a story based on what actions you take, Snatcher is more like reading a book, discovering several pages are stuck together, and then going through a fairly tedious process to separate those pages without damaging them so you can continue reading the story. Well, maybe it's not quite that bad. There are the beginnings of what you can generously call open world elements, as we can jump into our turbo cycle and basically go to any location we've already visited. It's just that most of these locations have nothing to do in them because this is a linear game. Then there's a shooting gallery minigame that is basically fine, and many of the puzzles we have to solve in order to progress, at least on the surface, resemble actual detective work. These can take the form of using a computer to cross-reference names and find out information about characters and even the people who develop the game. Putting together a composite of a face based on a description given by an eyewitness, and analysing a photo for details that may identify its location. So there are definitely some wins here, and I'll highlight a few of those as we go. Our major gameplay loop is only a small step up from a text-based adventure game. The step up being the awesome visuals that we've already talked about, and, at least for the Sega CD version, the inclusion of voice acting of various quality.
Gillian, it's terrible. What we've done.
Jamie, what's wrong?
When entering an area, you basically have a list of options for what you can do, and you'll get a text prompt explaining what taking each action does, with certain actions uncovering items to go into your inventory, or moving you into the next part of the scene. The two most notable actions are look and investigate. Having two commands that do variations of the same thing is clearly some kind of weak attempt at creating something like gameplay. Selecting look will open up a new submenu of things that you can look at, and selecting investigate will open basically the same submenu, but you'll get a different response depending on if you're looking or investigating. The idea being that you have to figure out if something needs to be looked at or investigated, which is just totally pointless. Because surely if I'm investigating something, then I'm looking at it, and clearly I don't want to miss anything, so I'm not going to have some big aha moment where I figure out which of these two commands is best to use. I'm just going to go down the list clicking everything until I've exhausted all options, so there's no reason to have two lists instead of one. The problem here is once you've chosen the item you're either looking at or investigating and got the response, you're kicked all the way back to the look and investigate menu and have to start again from the top. But wait, there's more. You see, games have to get more challenging as they go, right? Well, don't worry. Snatcher has got you covered there, by making it so prompts later in the game need to be pressed multiple times, giving you a selection of useless responses to read, before finally giving you the one that you want, kicking you all the way back out of the menu each time. This is frustrating as hell and completely unnecessary. This one feature alone was almost enough to make me peace out of the game and forget all about this video. And I'd say whether or not you can deal with it is going to affect whether you yourself can see this through to the end. The rest though, well, that's a little more interesting. While so-called mechanics like the above system make gameplay feel more like an afterthought, there really is a lot of interesting, if not fully realized stuff going on in the puzzle department. Items in your inventory can be inspected, as you might in a survival horror game, as well as shown to other people to get some kind of hint or input on the subject. However, one of the more interesting elements is the Jordan AI computer you have. Here you can look up the lore of the Snatcher world, but also look up names of people you've been into contact with, or are looking for, and get information on them. A simple example from the early game would be when you first try to enter Gibson's house, and his daughter isn't convinced that you're a junker here on business. She asks you to look up some information on a particular birthmark she has before she'll open the door. This informant here likewise wants to test your history knowledge in order to guess his password, and while you could just head online and look up the correct responses, there's something quite charming about typing all this into the Jordan search engine in-game, then sitting down with a pen and paper and writing out what you need to know in order to solve the puzzle. This quasi-real-world interaction is partly what creates the moments where you really feel like you're doing some sleuthing. And it's something that gets lost in modern games where everything is recorded in an in-game journal, and objective markers lead you to where you want to go. Imagine, for example, if Prey 2017 or Deus Ex Mankind Divided had a hardcore mode that basically switches off the journal and leaves it on you to carefully read every email and message and keep your own notes on important things like codes and the locations of things you might want to check out later. Not everyone's cup of tea for sure, but I think I personally could get something of a kick out of that. Another place this happens is with Metal Gear's phone and the saving system. Just like in the Metal Gear games, these ones, not this one, saving in Snatcher is handled through an in-game interaction rather than a pause menu. Talk to Metal Gear and he'll log everything you've done up to this point. But he also has a video phone that you have to actually input the numbers of people you want to contact into in order to call them. Imagine explaining dialing a phone number to today's gamers. And while Metal Gear can remind you what the numbers are, you're better off just noting them all down to save yourself the ear lashing from him. This is all very charming, and I even got pretty excited when I was watching this advertisement, saw a number and inputted it just to see what would happen. It turns out I was jumping ahead in the game a little bit, but I appreciate that it was left out there in the open for anyone to find anytime they wanted. A couple of other standouts are trying to construct a face in Jordan based on a description you've been given. This was a nice idea, but it's all a little too obtuse. Like, how do you know which of these is supposed to be a piercing gaze? Especially when the person who gave you the description was so distracting? You likewise aren't given any hints as to what you've got wrong when it happens. I feel like this puzzle filtered a lot of players back before the internet. There's also a great little puzzle where you're trying to locate a hospital with a strange name based on one photo. We're sort of left to our own devices to jump through the mental hoops necessary to realize that the neon sign in the picture was malfunctioning, and so certain letters weren't what we initially thought. I would have really liked a lot more of this, and a lot less of whatever the hell this is. For a game being made in the 1980s that was taking up most of its disk space with high-resolution pixel art, this is some pretty out there stuff, and I can see why it hit so hard with people who played it at the time, and why they have such fond memories of it. It's sort of how I feel about certain games that were on the Sega CD. None of these are particularly great, but they were just offering me something I hadn't experienced before, and short of buying an expensive PC, I couldn't get anywhere else. They were also highlighting what gaming could become with just a little more power. The last area to touch on is the shooting game. It's this. It's fine. I just think the difficulty jumps a little too much towards the end. I was trying to be very precise through most of the game, one enemy, one bullet sort of thing. But by the final battle, I was basically spamming the fire button while moving the cursor. Thankfully, there's no reloading. So, yeah, the gameplay is something of a mixed bag. It speaks both to Kojima as a visionary who wanted to push the medium and try new and exciting things, but also how he really would rather be making movies, and how he places the interactive elements as a secondary feature in his interactive stories. It's no surprise really that the opening hour of Death Stranding is just 55 minutes of watching Norman Reedus walk around shirtless, and 5 minutes of picking up boxes, when you stop to think how things started out for this guy. Okay, so since Snatcher is a very story-first kind of experience, it wouldn't be right to talk about the game and not drill down, at least some of the way, into what it's about. So even though I'm not going to cover everything here, I'm going full spoilers on the things I do touch on, which is going to include the big reveals at the end. So I'm going to count to 3 and give anyone who doesn't want to know any spoilers a chance to click off and skip to the end, then we're going in. Okay? Okay. 1, 2, 3. So the Snatcher's big weakness is that their artificial skin is flawed, and serious exposure to ultraviolet rays is a huge problem for them. So, cyber vampires, I guess. This restricts their movements to nighttime and means they're more active in the winter when the nights are longer. Gibson was in the process of tracking down a hospital that the Snatchers were using to get their skin fixed prior to his sudden and severe case of beheading. Tonally, the story is kind of a mess, with the way it switches between dark and gritty, and just plain goofy at times. I think I can sum it up in a mid-game scene where Gibson's daughter Katrina, who's also an 18-year-old model for no particular reason, calls up the Junkers saying she has something to give Gillian, and that she's also concerned for her safety. We arrive at her house to find the place has been, seemingly, ransacked, and the house dog nowhere to be found. This scene ends with a fairly grisly moment where the dog, now gutted, is thrown through a window, presumably as some kind of warning. Gillian makes no effort to look into who threw the dog, even though it was definitely a snatcher, and his whole gig is tracking them down. Instead, he heads back to Junker HQ to prioritize finding Katrina, who, as it turns out, decided the safest thing for her to do was head to Gillian's apartment, break in, and then just take a shower, meaning she's conveniently naked and wet for when our boy arrives home. I can't think of any other word to describe this other than immature. This girl has lost her dad, been left to handle paying for her house and the rest of her life by herself, and now her dog has been killed? But sure, we can throw a quick booby shot in there. That's not going to destroy the mood we're trying to build at all. In terms of writing and atmosphere, Snatcher is at its absolute best in some of its darkest moments. Coming back to this hospital I mentioned earlier, it's very creepy in and of itself, but it's the discovery of an identical hospital underneath which adds a double creep factor to the experience. And this is also where we get to see firsthand what happens to the various people who get snatched and... well, of course we all knew this is where it was going, but having it thrown up in your face like that really sells the point of just how dangerous these things are. At the end of Act 2, after brutalizing a drug dealer in a manner that would raise a lot of red flags were it added to a game today, we get to an encounter with a couple of snatchers and get saved at the last minute by Fade Routher from the 1984 adaptation of Dune. I'm sorry, I meant Random Hajil. How did nobody get sued for this? Random is a bounty hunter. These exist because snatchers are so dangerous and have killed so many junkers that the government thought the best thing to do was get private citizens involved by putting bounties on snatchers. So these super awesome top trained agents are getting bodied by these things left, right and center, and you think the best option is to allow anybody to go looking for them? Anyway, Random is someone who was clearly meant to play a much bigger role in the larger story that got trimmed down before the release. He shows up for a couple of scenes, doesn't really have enough screen time to establish any character credentials or become someone the audience cares about, before bravely sacrificing himself to allow Gillian to escape the hospital in the late game. I really don't have any feelings about this guy because even with the big reveal about him in the final chapter, I just don't have any reason to give a shit. Oh, he looks cool and edgy and he rides a bike and he's a bad boy who doesn't play by anyone's rules, not even his own. So cool. Sorry, but a bad haircut and a motorbike aren't a personality. But I've brought up the ending a couple of times already, so we really need to get into that because things get... yeah. So later in the game we get a lead that one of the members of the Junkers is actually a snatcher who's been working against us all along. While in the hospital we are able to reconstruct the face of this attractive corpse to discover it's the Chief, a revelation that has Gillian looking like this. After escaping certain death at the hospital, we arrive back at Junker HQ to find the place has been attacked, and Mika is seriously injured, and Harry is dying. Again, I guess this scene was supposed to hit harder, especially with the big revelation to come, but just like with Random, Harry is someone I've hardly had any chance to get to know at all. Sure, he works for the Junkers and he set me up with Metal Gear, but for all I know he goes home and beats his wife and kids every night. He's really not a character to me, he's just an NPC who I talked to a couple of times. So anyway, a helpful Snatcher explains to us that the world leaders are meeting in Kyoto to discuss the potential Snatcher threat and what to do about it, and the Snatchers, having finally fixed the flaws in their artificial skin, are planning to snatch all of the world leaders and insert themselves into positions of power all around the world. So, what are the world leaders going to do about the problem? Well, clearly they just need to fund the Junkers better so that they can at least replace the one guy they lost in the line of duty, and maybe hire, you know, an entire army of people with cutting-edge scanner technology to help track down all the Snatchers who've already infiltrated society and locate their base of operations. This is, after all, a threat to the security of the entire world, and so no expense should be spared. Actually, they settle on the much cheaper option of just obliterating Neo Kobe and everyone in it. Yeah, it really is that dumb. Snatchers have gone from being a threat exclusively handled by these 5 people to something so serious we can justify nuking an entire city just on the off chance that we'll get all of them, even though there's no evidence to suggest that the Snatchers originated in Neo Kobe. Did anyone run this script past a 5-year-old? Because I'm pretty sure even they would have had some questions here. The only thing that might stay their hand is if Gillian can somehow locate the Snatcher nest and offer that up as a target versus an entire city full of people. Look, I get that this is sci-fi and the world went through some shit with the Lucifer Alpha outbreak, but I'm pretty sure that North Korea isn't running things, even in this somewhat dystopian future. But don't think we're done with stupid yet. Oh no. This, after all, is a Kojima story, and layering on twist after twist which can all be revealed rapid fire at the end, rather than gradually as the mystery unfolds, presumably to make Gillian do this, get used to it, I have this as a PNG now, is a par for the course of this guy. The plot contrives to basically get Gillian and Jamie together in the Snatcher base. Oh, and Jamie has gotten her memory back, somehow. We basically discover that the Snatchers were developed in an old Soviet Union Cold War weapons project. The idea was to create robots that could be perfect copies of world leaders and replace the actual world leaders with Soviet-controlled puppets. Oh, they also developed Lucifer Alpha in case they for some reason needed to snatch an entire city overnight. You know, they could just murder a whole city of people and then bring in hundreds of thousands of Snatchers to switch them out and dispose of all the bodies overnight. Anyway, Gillian was actually a CIA operative who was collecting data on the research and feeding it back to the USA and in turn, the UN. When power changed hands in the Soviet Union, the project was shut down and everyone involved was due to stand trial for crimes against humanity, and it all would have been perfect too if it wasn't for this guy.
Who's there?
It's been a while, hasn't it, Jamie? Ah, yes. And Gillian. It's me, Jamie.
Okay, so the project was run by this guy, Professor Mognar, and his son Elijah and Jamie were also working on it. Jamie claims that many of the scientists working on the project were doing so against their will, but never specifically says that she was one of them. So maybe she's just a terrible person. Anyway, since this is a Kojima game, maybe you can guess that the gameplay was left behind long ago, and we're now just watching an extended cutscene for the end. We don't have any kind of final showdown here. Metal just shows up and blows the place up and still manages to look adorable in the process. Okay, so we've got our mastermind right here, and we still haven't figured out why Gillian and Jamie look so young, even though they were involved in this project 56 years ago. Now, one of the most important things for villains is their motivation, and Kojima does a pretty good job with this. Guys like Liquid Snake and Senator Armstrong are absolutely awesome villains who are complex and nuanced and worthy of their own essays. So what's our boy's motivation here?
Jamie, it's you. Your beauty is the cause of all that has come to pass here.
Oh great, another fucking incel who wants to make it everyone else's problem. But Arkham, you clearly went crazy from being isolated for so long. No. I'm sorry, no. Being crazy isn't a get out of jail free card for your villain. In fact, you have to be a hell of a good writer to write a crazy villain. You can do it. There are some really great ones even in Kojima's work, but this ain't it. So yada yada, weird guy was jealous that Jamie married Gillian, released the death virus, and they all went into cryostasis, with his master plan being to never wake up Gillian or something. I don't know. I tuned out at this point. Oh, and Harry was actually Gillian and Jamie's son from back before they were frozen, and Random was also a Snatcher. It's a very weak conclusion to a story that showed a lot of promise. Now you could lay a lot of the blame for weak characterization and nonsensical plot holes on the story getting cut down from 5 chapters to first 2, and then having a third tacked on during the Sega CD port. And I concede that. This really feels like a story that was cut down dramatically from something much bigger. And while I respect that these people clearly had a vision and were working so hard to create something unique, original, and even beautiful in a way, and I can see a ton of potential here, a lot of the blame still falls on our visionaries' shoulders. In the end, if you have a 1,000-page novel, you don't try to fit it into a 2-page short story for a magazine. You take one scene or element from it and write it into a full story. Of course, I don't know at what point cuts were leveled at the time, but given they were well over deadline with development when this happened, they should have seen this coming and made course corrections. Regardless of anything else we can say about the era this was created in and the technology they were working with, it does have to stand on its own legs. And while there are many elements and moments in this game that do, the ending really doesn't. I described Snatcher at the start of the video as something of a museum piece. It's a moment in time where a small group of people led by someone with big ideas tried to do something original in video games and just didn't quite land it. I can see why this game reviewed and sold badly on its release in the States, but I also totally get why people love it and why it developed such a dedicated cult following. I will say that anyone hyping this up as some definitive cyberpunk fiction is really kidding themselves. While there are some incredible visuals and story moments in the game, and the art and sound design really sell the atmosphere in so many of the scenes, the plot is overall a baffling mess filled with underdeveloped characters and glaring plot holes any amateur writer could have seen. Likewise, the things that hit hardest in this game are mostly things either heavily inspired by or just straight up stolen from other media. Still, that doesn't mean that the mystery isn't interesting and that there aren't a lot of cool, if underbaked ideas on display here. I really could see this game blowing people away back at launch. So to conclude, did I have a good time playing Snatcher? Yes, I mostly did. So is Snatcher a good game? Snatcher is a Hideo Kojima game. And that might be all you need to know to decide if you want to play it or not. Well, the holiday season is coming, sadly, to a close. I'm actually a big lover of Christmas, and I like to make a small effort to get into the spirit, even being so far away from my family like I am. As such, I always set aside 3 games for Christmas Day, and try to make playing them as much of an event as I can. There's always 1 AAA game, 1 indie, and 1 retro game that I play for epic nostalgia kicks. GOG, Epic, and Steam, however, conspired to make sure that by Christmas Day I had a lot more to choose from. Even among this large and varied selection of bangers though, there was one game that clearly rose to the top and stole most of my time, completely blowing my mind in the process. So how about we strap in and take a ride to the Ishimura?
The USG Ishimura.
Alright, dick. And step into the heavy magnetized boots of Isaac Clarke, as for the first time I take on Dead Space. Okay everyone, I guess I'm back. Sorry for the hiatus, burnout's a bitch. So if you're here then thank you for staying all the way to the end, and if you took a shot every time I said the word snatch in the video, well, let's just say I promise I will never fuck with you. So I figured I'd take a couple of minutes to do a quick channel update. The Rivallon video was way too much work and honestly made me not enjoy the process of making videos, hence the break. I also got too focused on the wrong thing. I was so intent on the idea of my extra long video blowing up and got so disappointed when it didn't. I missed several Legacy of Kain videos breaking the 10k click mark, my Final Fantasy videos jumping up in numbers, and my Signalis video now closing in on 20k views. The channel also broke 2k subs, in no small part thanks to your favourite son pinging me out of nowhere and asking me to collab on his Christmas video, for which I am extremely thankful. So yeah, for a small channel, I really am doing quite well, I'd say, and I just want to say thanks to all of you who watch and comment on my videos. It's really appreciated. It's no secret that I dabble mainly as a hobby in game design, but I've decided that this year I'm going to put a lot of energy into creating some kind of slice for my own survival horror game. As such, YT will have to slow down a little. I'll still try to get at least one video a month out. I mean, I've got so many potential candidates at the moment, and I may share periodic updates of my work in Unreal when I have something worth showing. Anyway, I think I've taken more than enough of your time for one day. If I haven't, well, there are other videos on my channel for you to check out, and if you're new here, well, why not subscribe? Follow me on Twitter and/or Facebook, and maybe tip me a coffee here. Thanks a million, and I'll see you in the next one.